Welcome to Securing Success, where we get to know the professionals that make up the cybersecurity sector. Today, I have with me Amy DeSalvatore. She's a partner at the standout venture capital firm, NightDragon Security, and she leads the firm's business development and platform efforts. Amy, I'm excited to have you on. I think a lot of people are going to get some value out of this.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Mark. I'm excited too. I'm so glad you're doing this. And I hope we get to talk a little bit about our relationship with Pinpoint because it's a big part of the platform here and what we've built. So nice to be here today. Thanks for having us.
I appreciate that. As you know, I talk to a lot of people in the industry and I bring up NightDragon pretty often. Lots of people know about NightDragon, some don't. So I want to start off by not assuming everybody watching is going to know who NightDragon is. You've been hugely influential in the cybersecurity sector specifically. And I want you to tell me a little bit about who NightDragon is and what makes it so unique from a VC perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question, and we have a good answer for it. So I want to start with the name, because I think some people think that it's just kind of a fun, novel name, and it's fun to kind of hear the history behind it. NightDragon is actually the code name for one of the first cyber attacks that was waged against the US by the Chinese government. And it happened in the time frame of 2009 to 2011, when our founder and CEO of the firm, Dave DeWalt, was the CEO of McAfee. And it had a special meaning to him because McAfee's research team was chartered to lead the investigation of the attack. And it was their technology, their intrusion detection systems and software and hardware that ultimately helped with the remediation and mitigation of it. And so it was a seminal moment for Dave DeWalt, and he decided that if ever he had a venture firm, he would name it NightDragon. And so that's the name behind it. And the reason that that's also important, it speaks to one of the key differentiators at NightDragon, and that is that Dave came from the cybersecurity world. He was not only the CEO of McAfee, but he was also the CEO of FireEye and the chairman of Mandiant, three standout cybersecurity firms that really kind of helped pioneer the world of cyber. And similar to Dave, everyone else that's here at NightDragon came from the corporate cyber world. I came from Forescout Technologies. I was there for 7 years, leading global strategic alliances and channel, and helped that company go public. But after that, before that, I was at Intel Security and McAfee, EMC, and Documentum, which were all Dave's companies. So I've been in cyber for about 15 years, and tech for about 25. And the same story kind of goes for Ken Gonzalez, who's Dave's partner and managing director in Morgan Kayak. And what that means is that we're all strategic operators first and foremost, and we understand how to scale cyber companies, more so than being financially oriented investors, right? We understand investing, obviously, because we've learned that trade, but our forte and our special secret sauce, if you will, when it comes to managing portfolio companies, is working with them to help them understand go-to-market strategy and take their products and scale them into the market. And we do that primarily through partnerships. And so we're uniquely positioned to do that because we come from that world. And so that's kind of NightDragon's special value add for our portfolio companies.
And that's a huge value add. And I want to talk about that for a second. But before I forget, because I think this is important, right now, in this day and time, cyber attacks by governments, by bad actors, I mean, it's a daily occurrence. Nobody bats an eye. But when you talk about NightDragon, just off the top of your head, do you know around what time frame that initial attack was that Dave and his team at McAfee were tasked with defending? Because I think that's important context.
It was 2011.
Woo! So
yeah.
Over 10 years ago, when cybersecurity was thought of as firewalls and just very basic perimeter elements, it wasn't what it is today. All of a sudden, we're talking about an attack, and Dave and you and everybody else has grown with that industry and these threat vectors.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other key thing to think about when you think about that attack, and the reason it was so critical, is that the attack was specifically designed to go after the financial services systems and financial data of large critical infrastructure companies that we rely on for our day-to-day. So oil, gas, energy, petrochemical companies. And so they were stealing data from those organizations, which ultimately translates to an impact to our everyday lives. And so critical infrastructure attacks, that was sort of the beginning of that happening by some of the other nation states. And it's now become a major focus for us as a firm. A lot of the companies that we work with provide protections for the critical infrastructure industry. And we're coming up with new strategies to help thwart those attacks, including things like cyber physical convergence and managing threats within a single context.
You know, that's crazy. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. We could probably talk for an hour on this particular subject, but you know, it's one thing when you get a notice, which I just did pretty recently, that my social security number was compromised. It's another thing to know that a water treatment facility or a pipeline is going to specifically and significantly disrupt our daily lives and potentially cause casualties. So huge point in the industry right now. So you're talking about investing into companies, you're talking about these threats that have evolved and grown over time, but it is clear to me, and I know it's clear to you, Amy, that the funding landscape is different than it was from just a year ago. But that said, there are still plenty of founders in technology that serve to be attractive investments. So when you identify an exciting product or founder, how does NightDragon differentiate the value it adds versus other competing investors?
So the first thing to consider is that NightDragon's a late stage investor. And that means that we're investing in companies that usually hover around the 30 million to 80 million in ARR range. Typically, when people think of investors, they think of early stage, seed, a Series A companies. We're a little bit later stage, and that is by design. We like growth stage companies. And the reason that we like growth stage companies is for the reasons that I described earlier. Because we're all strategic operators and we've been in the trenches and can help these portfolio companies grow and scale, we want to work with companies that are right at that critical point in their life cycle, where if they flip the switch internally and externally from a direct sales force to leveraging partners and establishing an indirect sales model, and identifying new routes to market through partners, then we can have an impact on their business. And that generally happens or occurs with companies that are within that range, right between that 30 million to 80 million in ARR. If you're earlier than that, you're a little too early to start leveraging partners. You're still very much a direct sales force. And so we want to work with companies where we can apply what we call NightScale. NightScale is the platform that we've built internally, which is essentially an ecosystem of partners that we've put in place, primarily value-added distribution partners and resellers. And we can immediately apply a set of preferred terms and working with those partners to our companies, onboard them into those partner programs, and almost immediately start seeing scale through increased reach that the portfolio companies get through those partners and access to their customer base and their resellers. And so that's kind of the differentiator in working with NightDragon, is that we have a specific formula that we've built and now apply to portfolio companies who are right in that sweet spot of a growth stage.
So I want to jump into a topic I plan to talk about a little further down the line, but it's applicable here. You are a later stage investor for the most part at NightDragon. I track, as you know, all the venture funding that takes place in cybersecurity. And one of the really notable elements I've seen in the past couple quarters is that seed A and B round companies have really dominated the funding landscape in terms of volume, right? So there's way more of those really early stage companies that are attracting investment. How has this dynamic impacted NightDragon's strategy, if at all? What have you had to make any changes to your business approach based on this situation that we're seeing?
So we've been tempted, I'm not going to deny that, and the reason that we've been tempted to invest in earlier stage, although we have not given into the temptation, is because of the emergence of AI and the AI revolution that you're seeing. A lot of the AI companies in fact, all of them are very early stage. And so there is some fear that, we are tracking the companies and we will invest in them when they get to a certain stage, but it is tempting to get involved with the ones that we're really identifying with earlier in the cycle. Our strategy, though, for making sure that we're watching those companies and still capturing them throughout their life cycle is we have very close partners on the early stage side. So for example, we work very closely with Team8, which is an early stage investor, with Allegis Capital. In fact, in some cases, we have business arrangements with them where we share in the returns on the companies. And so the reason that that's important is because we can rely on our trusted partners to invest in those companies at a very early stage. And we may consider working with that company from an advisory capacity. NightDragon also has an advisory arm. And then when they get to the stage where they're growth and they're ready for our services and value add, then we may apply capital or equity and invest in them. And so that's been our strategy to date. But the general thesis is to stay tried and true to growth stage, because that's where we have the most value. And it's a huge market. NightDragon actually invests in a sector called CSSP. So it's not just cybersecurity. The C stands for cyber, but then we also invest in safety, physical security, national security, and privacy companies. And so because we've got this larger sector, that market is about a $400 billion market. So think about that. It's a $500 billion. And that market is what we're going after. And it's lucrative enough and large enough in scope that we have plenty of options to invest in. It's true that there are less growth stage than early stage, but there's still plenty to choose from and some really, really hot and interesting companies out there.
So interesting. And just, you guys are big business. I'm a small business owner, but one of the things that I find in these situations, unfortunately or unfortunately, I don't know how you look at it, I've been through these dips a few times in my career so far. And one of the things I learned over time, and one of the things that we've implemented now is staying disciplined to our approach, because these are just moments in time at the end of the day. And there are all those temptations, and people ask you, well, why don't you go in to do this so you can supplement some revenue? And it's like, no, we're just going to stick it out, because this industry isn't going to go anywhere. You touched on a couple of things that I really am curious to know more about, and I really believe is one of the more notable differentiators. And that's that NightDragon is really involved in the ecosystem, the community, right? So cybersecurity and national security communities. I saw Dave DeWalt. He had a conversation, I don't know, several months ago with General David Petraeus. I was like, wow, cool. I know some of the guests that you had RSA specifically were associated with national security and government agencies. And so with all the partnerships you have, all the leverage you have with those organizations, tell us about why this community engagement that you referenced, that I just referenced, is so important to NightDragon.
Yes, that's a fun question for us to answer. So NightDragon, and what you're referring to specifically, is kind of we rest on the mission and the thesis and really identify with the idea of public-private partnership. And that's the idea that you need to be working closely with government. The commercial sector, the private sector, and public sector need to be coordinated and need to be working together to provide protections for the nation and ultimately for the world. And the reason that we believe that so fervently is Dave, again, sort of from his experience being in the corporate world, very quickly learned that if you win the government in business, meaning you have solutions that the government is buying and get on key capture and strategic program agreements that they're driving, you ultimately win the market. So it's almost a first, it's a first strategy that you need to deploy to then have the commercial markets follow behind, because government is really leading innovation in terms of understanding what's happening offensively at the government and the adversary level. And what we do at NightDragon is we then identify the best commercial defenses to scale up and meet that demand. So think of us as the defense and the government coming at it from an offensive angle. And if we can get our portfolio companies working with government and get their product and solutions built into the requirements of some of the strategic government programs that the defense industrial base partners and others are releasing, then that obviously leads a nice trail for the commercial markets to then see validation of what our companies are doing and ultimately adopt that technology. So there is a commercial interest in doing it, but it's also just the right thing to do from a mission perspective. Government is, you know, we're a democracy here in the U.S. and we love that, but there's also an element of we have to take responsibility for working together and holding government responsibility from a standards standpoint and making sure that we're all safe. And the only way to do that is through collaboration and working with government. If you look at China, for example, you know, it's a totally different political structure, but they've got government who's paid for a 15 square mile training center for cybersecurity. And so we are in some ways in a disadvantage because they've got government who are funding all of these efforts. And while we don't want to adopt their political system, we have a situation where we can achieve some of the same protections and maybe educational programs for cyber if we work with government collaboratively and help each other build those programs together. And so that's sort of why we are so invested in government. And you see us featuring government officials and government luminaries and dignitaries at our innovation summit and constantly working with our portfolio companies to help them understand how to enter the government market. In fact, we actually have a head of government services, a business unit with a NightDragon that's fully focused on helping them get government ready. And so, and then the thought leadership aspect, I just can't stress enough how important that is. Dave has very strong ties to the US government and foreign governments. He's now the vice chair of Jen Easterly's Cybersecurity Advisory Committee, and he chairs the subcommittee for corporate governance and responsibilities. So there's a lot of work that we're doing to help with education of boards and making sure that we're raising cybersecurity awareness and education at the board level. And beyond that, you know, he's served on 4 administrations. He's part of the National Security Telecommunications Committee Advisory Council. So there's just a lot of work that needs to be done for public and private entities to come together, and we want to be at the forefront of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost inevitable that in the current landscape and just what we talked about earlier on, especially with that physical and cyber convergence, commercial business needs to work with government, other way around. And that's how we might win this out, right? That's just my personal opinion. But I think that there can be so much more innovation when you let people run free, come up with things, give them incentives to do that, as opposed to everything being controlled by a central government. But I'll digress from that for a minute. Right. I want to just briefly move away from NightDragon, Amy, and I want to know more about you. You gave us a really quick snippet. You spent some time at Forescout. You managed alliances. How do you end up working for a VC like NightDragon with the professional pedigree you come from previously?
Well, it wasn't planned. I was at a place in my career, you know, as I mentioned, I've been in tech and in cyber for a very long time. And I was at Forescout, and you generally stayed at companies for a very long time. So I was at Forescout for about 7 years. And what happened is that Forescout got bought by a private equity firm. And it went from a growth company to something very different after private equity bought it. And it really wasn't a fun experience for me because I couldn't grow my team. The company was in a different stage, obviously, and PE had different plans for it. And so I knew that I needed to move on, but I also was at a place in my career where I'd been doing this for 25 years, business development specifically at tech companies. And the idea of going to another company and doing the exact same role, which would probably have been like an SVP of business development or something along those lines, really didn't appeal to me. In fact, it just sort of felt like I didn't get any excitement or inspiration from it. And it just, lucky enough, I had called Dave DeWalt to kind of talk to him about my next career move because he's been a mentor for me throughout the years. I've worked with him and around him for a very long time. He was on the board of Forescout, which is a large part of the reason that I was there. And he mentioned that he had this opportunity at NightDragon and that it was a biz dev role and that it was going to be very different than being in the corporate world, that they were really building something exciting and he could use somebody with my expertise. And I hung up the phone. I'll never forget that day. And I talked to my husband. I said, wow, I said, I think I found what I want to do next. And it's venture capital. And I've never uttered those words before. But I had seen somebody else in the industry who I deeply admire make that move. Her name is Dee Dayton, who you might know, and she had made a similar move going from the corporate world to Wing Capital. And so I thought, I'm going to call her and see how she feels about it. And she validated that it was the best move that she made. And I decided to do it something similar. And so I decided to roll the dice, really. And it is very different than being in the corporate world, but it's actually a lot of fun because you're sitting at the epicenter of cyber and you get to see, instead of working with one company, I'm working with 13 plus portfolio companies, and you really get a different perspective on the market, a much more well-rounded view of what's happening in the market and what's hot and where you should be focusing. And you are in a position where you're helping these multiple companies enter into new markets and helping with their build partnerships for them. And so it's rewarding at the same time. And then there's an entirely other new element to this role that I did not have as much of at Forescout and my other roles. And that's all around talent development and DEI, which I know we're going to talk more about. But that's been some of the most deeply gratifying work that I've ever done in my career. So that alone validates the move and makes me feel like I'm in the right place.
So I definitely want to talk about talent, but you said something, and I want to double click on it. So you said, and I really am curious about this. You hung up the phone after you talked with Dave, and I suspect in relatively short order you talked to your husband about the conversation, like you referenced. But did you make that decision right then and there, or were you like, I got to think about this? Was there apprehension, or were you just sold and ready to go?
No, there was a little apprehension, and the apprehension was around the fact that I'm averse to change, and the idea of being in a brand new environment where I know very little about venture capital and there's zero structure, because NightDragon at the time, and still is, a startup, like a very small startup. I think at the time there were only 6 people at the company. Now we're up to 18 or something, but we were very small. And the idea that there was no infrastructure and I wouldn't be going in with a formula like I would be in an SVP of BD role at a cyber company, that really scared me. It was terrifying. And so I did consider, should I just go to a company versus going to NightDragon? But the more I thought about it, and just having some trust in Dave and the excitement of being with NightDragon, who at that time already had a stellar brand, and Dave, obviously his reputation precedes him in cyber, I just thought it was such an awesome opportunity. I had to just bite the bullet and take my chances and do it. So there was some deliberation, but it wasn't very long. It was within, a week or so that I felt like I was going to be fully pursuing it.
And I think it's an incredible lesson, and more experienced and mature professionals, they've been through this before. But anybody that's, getting started in their career, if you happen to be watching this, that's a monumental moment, is grabbing an opportunity that comes at you from potentially out of nowhere and taking a risk, because that's how you become successful. And I don't need to presume, I know you're crushing it out there, Amy. I see you're winning awards all the time. Congrats on all that stuff. But if you don't take that risk, if you don't get out of your comfort zone, you'll be at another company and you'd probably be just fine. But look at what you're doing right now. So congrats on that. I respect it. And I wanted to tell you that as well.
Oh, thank you.
Before we jump into talent, how has now being exposed to 13 portfolio companies, how's the view from where you sit impacted your perception of the industry in general and startups as well?
Well, you quickly realize that, I came into the role thinking that my primary job was to help the startups grow and scale their business. And on paper, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. But anyone who's been in venture capital will tell you that you're in a constant state of feeding and driving innovation. If you don't feed and drive innovation, then you're not successful in your role. And so it starts with that, but then you realize to feed and drive innovation, you first need the brightest minds in the industry working for your companies. And not just the brightest minds in the industry, but you need diversity. You need diverse thinking. You need creative thinkers. You need people from different backgrounds, all walks of life, working for your organizations and collaborating in really meaningful ways. And so that then makes you realize, wow, my job is not necessarily scaling companies. My job, first and foremost, is talent and DEI. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. I need to first find the people to be at these companies and run them in a successful and culturally rich way. And so that's, at that point, you realize, wow, that's my responsibility, but it's also a pleasure because through that process, you're then helping people get into the exciting world of cybersecurity. And so, you know, you were part of this process with us, Mark, in that one of the first things I did when I started at NightDragon was we set up a program called ND Talent. And that program was designed to create an ecosystem of preferred relationships with placement partners like Pinpoint, and also non-for-profit organizations where we can have access to a diverse talent pool that our companies can tap into. And so we now work with you as our preferred cybersecurity placement agent. We work with Cyber Future Foundation, which is an organization that kind of sits at the organization of academia, government, and industry to help produce a diverse talent pool that organizations can tap into. We work with NextGen Talent. We work with Naomi Buckwalter's organization, which is Cybersecurity Gatebreakers Foundation. We work with the Athena Alliance. Those are kind of our core partners that we're working with to make sure that we have resources available when our companies need talented people, talented and diverse people. And so that was an epiphany for me getting into the role. I never realized that I would now be sort of a recruiter and a diversity advocate coming into the role. But you absolutely have to start there, because if we don't have people, bright minds in these companies, then we're not driving innovation. And as a venture firm, we're sort of dead in the water, and that's not a place that you want to be. So that's been a huge realization for me.
That's so exciting. And by the way, I don't know if you're even aware, I'm a mentor right now in the NextGen Talent pilot program, and there's some good things happening there. So I can see the value that's being added, not just to NightDragon and its portfolio companies, current and future, but the people that are taking advantage of it, the professionals, the up and comers, the new market entries. There's a lot of value that you're adding to them professionally. And it's all just a good ecosystem. In addition to all that partnership stuff we talked about, the talent is critical. And I love that you recognize that, because it's just, it's so crazy to me. And I know I have a bias, but I'm a recruiter, and I see, I just see people going about the recruitment process sometimes as if it's just another thing they got to do. That's a check in the box. There isn't a whole lot of emphasis. And the fact that you are emphasizing it on behalf of your portfolio companies, that is going to make a difference. And I love it. Beyond what we just discussed, is there anything else that NightDragon and you specifically, Amy, are doing to help your companies figure out the talent component of the business? Because if you don't have the right people at the end of the day, like you said, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah. Well, we sort of start with the resources that I described. I think that's really important, but we are kind of uniquely positioned to also then offer our personal and professional contacts over decades of being in the industry to help scale their business. So we do, once we learn of individual openings within this portfolio, we'll first kind of tap into our personal networks to see if we know of anyone. And then we also offer up and leverage the resources. The other thing that's really important with our chief people officers at our portfolio companies is to drive a sense of community and make sure that they're leveraging each other as a knowledge base and as a resource for best practices. And so what we have rolled out is a Chief People Officer NightDragon community session that takes place every few weeks. We do focus group sessions with them. We bring in guest speakers on compensation best practices. Sometimes we bring in placement firms or recruiting firms to help educate them on recruiting best practices. And that's really been a fabulous program. I think the community now knows that they have other people, like-minded people that they can turn to when they have questions or need support. And so that's just one of the communities that we spun up, but it's probably one of the more prominent ones is with our Chief People Officers. That also includes the HR professionals in those organizations. So that's another way that we kind of support that effort.
It's so great because sometimes you're at the top and you may want to unload or you need to have a conversation and you don't necessarily know where to go, or you don't want to project to certain people in the company that you have a question or uncertain, and to be able to go and talk to your peers in the industry and hear everybody out. I've got to imagine that's a huge release valve for any pressure that builds up. So that sounds amazing to me.
Yeah.
You mentioned this, and I want to dig in. Diversity, equity, inclusion. It's talked about all the time. It's everywhere. It's such a social conversation, but you seem passionate about it. I've heard you talk about it before. Why for you, right? I mean, really from Amy's perspective, not what everybody's talking about, but from Amy's perspective, why is this important?
Well, it became personal for me early in my career. I was for years, I started at Arthur Andersen very early on in my career and then ended up in technology companies. And I was, for a very long time, the only woman in the room. And at that point in time, I never really realized that it was a disadvantage for me to be the only woman in the room. I just sort of accepted it. Then when I ended up at Forescout, I was in more of an executive position, and there was another executive woman who later became my mentor, Julie Cullivan, who I think you know. And having her support in the meeting room and having her support in the company allowed me to kind of really shine as an individual. I realized I felt support in a way that I had never felt supported before, because there was somebody that looked like me and sort of identified with what I was saying and empathized with what I was saying and supported me in conversations with men that sometimes honestly kind of put me on the defensive. And I realized, wow, how powerful I could be and empowering it was for me to have another woman in the room with me supporting what I was doing. And at that point in time, it really inspired me to start getting involved with the Forescout Women's Network and some of the work that Julie was doing. So I became an ambassador for the Women's Network, and all of my diversity work really started there. It started with women. And that was why when I came over to NightDragon, the first partnership that I put in place was with the Athena Alliance, which is run by Coco Brown, who's an amazing individual who's dedicated her life to elevating women in the boardroom and C-level suites and providing them education. And so I started there, and then quickly realized it's not just about women. I have an obligation to help the underserved and underprivileged in other ways, and that our companies would perform better if we have a more diverse culture, not just of women, but of other people of other races and backgrounds and ideas and thought structures. And so at that point in time, I started expanding my efforts to a broader scope of what the definition of diversity is.
And that's really important. The way you laid it out, it tells me it's about perspective. If you cannot provide perspective because everybody's thinking the same way, maybe I don't know about your experience, but you said sometimes, you were on the defensive, right? And
yeah,
maybe people did that on purpose. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just didn't have perspective into how a woman that's basically solo at the executive level is going to feel in a certain situation. And so to be able to have an advocate like you, that's outstanding. I think that NightDragon portfolio companies, the industry is going to benefit from that in general.
Yep.
Anything
I
else?
just want to add one thing. I want to add one thing on that, because I think a lot of women will identify with this. When you feel like you're on the defensive, it kind of causes you to to shut down a little bit, because at that point, men in the room may label you as bitter or as difficult, right? Whereas if you're a man, you don't necessarily get those labels. You almost get commended or applauded for being a strong thinker or being a contrarian or speaking up. But when women do it, and it's a male, predominantly a male environment or patriarchal environment, it can be perceived very different. When other women are in the room, it kind of neutralizes that dynamic, and it makes you feel like, oh no, I did say the right thing, and I'm okay to be forceful, and I'm okay to have conviction in my approach, because men are doing it and they're getting along with it, and they're supported by their male peers. And now all of a sudden you feel supported by women who are in the same boat and experiencing those same things. And so it really starts to build your confidence in ways that you never could have imagined. And that was kind of the realization for me, that I needed to have more women in the room with me and with others.
You see yourself as a trailblazer?
Not really. Not really. I mean, I think there was a movement in general, and I was part of that movement. So I'm assisting the trailblazers. I'm part of the movement. Let's put it that way.
It's a noble cause. It really is.
Mm-hmm.
We've spent some time here, Amy, and I know you're busy. So I got a couple more things I want to ask you, and then I'm going to let you go. First and foremost, are there any technological components of the industry right now that you're looking into, and you and NightDragon, are there areas of interest that we might not know about that are emerging in cyber, or are there areas of interest that NightDragon may be expanding into outside of cyber that you want people to know about?
Yeah, well, we hit on one of them, and it's this idea of cyber physical convergence. We're very invested in that topic. In fact, we work from an advisory capacity with a company called Data that has the world's first platform, cyber physical platform. And just to kind of explain why that is such a powerful need and topic, if you look at what's happened in the industry, like let's take the Colonial Pipeline incident, for example, that attack started as a ransomware attack, so cyber, but then it quickly it transferred or evolved into a physical security risk event for us, which was the pipeline, right? And again, going back to critical infrastructure and how important that is to our daily lives and the potential impact it has. If you're looking at cyber threats and physical threats independently in a siloed fashion and not considering the full threat environment in its totality, then you're at risk. And so what we've been supporting Data in doing is converging those threat feeds into one platform so that you basically can get a sense of what's happening from a physical event and risk detection perspective alongside what the potential cyber threat is. And it ultimately gives you a much better view into what you're doing and can provide early warning signs for you to prevent an attack down the road. And so critical infrastructure is the kind of where we're seeing the first instantiation of where there's a dire need. But there's also areas like digital risk protection, for example. If you think about some of the financial attacks that have happened on organizations, or identity, or impersonating domain credentials, a lot of those attacks will start first in the deep dark web, which is a physical arena. And in the deep dark web, they'll be having conversations about launching the attack. If you can see that physical risk unfolding in the deep dark web and then have visibility into it before it actually materializes on the other side in the cyber world, you're ahead of the game. And that's a luxury that we haven't had previously before having these converged platforms. And so we're really excited about that area, and it's one that we're watching very closely. The other one that's really fun, from my perspective, is UAVs. So unmanned aerial vehicles, or UASs, unmanned aerial systems. We work with a drone company called Carlson Donny Aerospace that's just amazing. You have to think about, they've got high altitude, long endurance drones. And these drones are smart, They're fully autonomous and fully coordinated and flying, optimizing based on mission profiles, which is really cool. So they can swarm and they have payloads and sensors on them that are all communicating with each other and communicating with the ground. So if one of the drones falls out or is taken down, the others will fully and autonomously move into a swarm method and compensate for that loss. They also can fully deconflict based on the mission profile and based on weather patterns. So to me, that's very cool. And you can think of all the different use cases that you can use drones. My personal favorite is that they're using those drones to help with anti-poaching efforts and protect endangered species. And so because I'm such an animal advocate, that's obviously a use case that's pretty near and dear to my heart.
Well, you sound passionate about it. And we are entering we've entered, but I think it's becoming more clear to the average person, the crazy world that we are poised to be a part of. So that's so interesting. And I'll be looking into that a little more. You know, the last thing I want to ask you, Amy, is a little more on the personal front. You're working with huge sums of money, you and NightDragon, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars. You're working on elements like national security, anti-poaching efforts. I'm sure there's a lot of other applications that the drones can talk about, physical and cybersecurity, making sure that our infrastructure is safe so that there aren't physical casualties. There's a lot that goes into your job. And I suspect, because you're pretty impressive, but you're still a human being, there can be a stressful element. How do you deal with that? Is there anything specific that you do? Do you feel stressed out about it? Just give anybody watching this some perspective on the human side of it.
Yeah, gosh, this is an area where I wish I had a good answer, because I would be healthier and a better person if I did. But the reality is that I have not figured that out. I mean, more so than any role that I've ever been in, because the gravity of what you're dealing with is so big and you are so tied into national security, and you're supporting multiple companies, not just one company, and it's all kind of resting on your value add and your investments on the line. All of that makes it very, very stressful. And what it does to me is it makes me work harder and work smarter, but also harder. And that's not always a great answer, because then you just work yourself into a frenzy and into the ground. And that's what I'm honestly, as a human being, struggling with right now in venture, is how do I balance my personal life with the workload and the desire and the mission-oriented work that I'm doing with venture? Because I could spend every minute of every waking hour doing work either for NightDragon or my DEI efforts. It's that important, and it drives you to that degree. But at the same time, I have issues where, my personal life is suffering at times. My husband's not getting attention. My dog misses me. And so those are all areas where I'm still trying to figure that out. I can tell you that where I have found that I am the most productive is when I really get, back to your point, disciplined. And I say to myself, look, 3 days a week, I have a personal trainer. I'm working out, lifting weights. Weight training at my age is really, really important. And I do not compromise. The other piece is walking. At my age, I need to be walking constantly. And so what I generally do, if I go through periods where I have 3 days a week of walking to the gym, working out for an hour, and then walking back, which is usually about a 4-mile walk in total each day, at the end of that week, I am a different person and feel so much more balanced and capable of taking on my job. It's when that gets compromised and I end up traveling and indulging in the work in the way that I'm kind of doing now, that I feel a little bit less stable. And so it's a constant struggle to strike that balance. And it's not one that I've really figured out yet. I know what I need to do, but exercising the discipline to do it is another story.
Well, I appreciate your candor there, right? And that just shows the level of confidence you have in yourself and your professionalism, because some people, you ask them that question, they feel a little vulnerable and they don't want to say that they're stressed or they have those moments. And you gave a great answer. So I appreciate it. Mm-hmm. It humanizes everything that you do. This has been an incredible conversation. I'm so excited to look back at this and share it with everybody out there. Anybody that's watching this that is interested in this opportunity to have this conversation with professionals like Amy, tune into the next episode.